we are hosting this discussion on the day of a shutdown. And it's really good that we all were able and managed to come here. But of course, this all emerges out of a country that is under siege on multiple fronts, a country that is under perpetual crises, having failed to build the capacities and capabilities to deal with an intergenerational crisis of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. We are also facing a climate crisis. And in all this malaise, the left has, I guess, failed to capture the imagination of a disaffected and hopeless populace. And within that, the populist right has captured and now comfortably occupies this vacuum. With that, the quality of debate has deteriorated and has been mystified by an abhorrence towards foreign nationals who are blamed for all manner of transgressions by the state. And the success of the right is to use the failure of state provision, which we see in energy, which we see in transport, which we see in healthcare, which we see in all manner of public goods, as a right to commodify goods to entrench a neoliberal economic order. So today the left is fragmented between the so-called official left, the South African Communist Party, of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, in alliance with the ANC, that is known as the official left, and the so-called independent left, who consist of a motley crew of trade unions, social movements, and civic associations, unaligned to a particular political party. So if the left is to succeed in building a viable alternative, it must regroup. And such a regrouping must encompass as many traditions, organizations, and currents across the diverse and vibrant spread of the South African left. There have been attempts at this. Many of you sitting here today and some of us in the panel have been part of these various attempts, whether it's the United Front, the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party, the Working Class Movement, the Summit, the DFL, many attempts at really articulating a different left and alternative tradition. So today what we want to do is to evaluate these in terms of how they can advance class struggle politics and to contribute to a broader political movement of the workers, the poor, and the landless. So today we have three distinguished guests. We have Lebogang Mulaisi. Lebogang, I always get, you know me and your surname, I always get this wrong, excuse my friend. Is the Labour Market Policy Coordinator at COSATU, where she coordinates the implementation of COSATU's labour market policy. She's an EXCO and MANCO member of NEDLAC and represents and is also one of the commissioners in the Presidential Climate Commission. And then we're also joined by Pindile Gunene, who is the program manager of democracy and political culture at the FES. Pindile has over 10 years work experience in the social justice sector as an educator, a communicator, a researcher, and a strategist. And her passion is education, with her training and principles firmly rooted in the Freudian and feminist traditions. Then we're also joined by Dale McKinley, who is an independent writer, a researcher, and a lecturer based in Johannesburg with a PhD in international political economy and African studies, and the author of multiple books and is widely written. So, Lebogang, can I start with you? Yep.
Thank you very much, Basani, and thanks for inviting me to this discussion. When I got the invitation, I thought, wow, how career limiting for me to come and talk about this just of the alliance. But we're here now. we're here now. So let's rock and roll. I mean, comrades, you laugh, but when we look at how polarized this discussion, right, of the alliance manifests itself within the Tripartite Alliance, you will understand why this is a hot potato of some sort that no one has, for me, the courage to kind of deal with, right? The 14th National Congress tries to do this, but again, it seems to be a failed attempt because within an alliance are vested interests. Within COSATU, within the ANC, and within the SACP. And when you interrogate those vested rights, I think these is where the contradictions come in. And this is where the butting of the heads kind of does come in. And I find it very difficult to kind of like to have this discussion because, I mean, when I look at the beginning of the alliance, I wasn't even born yet. So maybe that places me in a better position to be critical of the performance of the alliance as opposed to the people that I'm in the organization with. But needless to say, I mean, when you do look into the formation of the alliance and what it sought to achieve, at its core, this is a meeting of minds of what you'd like to believe is three independent organizations coming together in an alliance to defeat the apartheid capitalist system. And they are able to succeed in this, and I guess that's where the nostalgia comes from. But in its most purest form, what was the aspiration was that three independent organizations would be joined in an alliance with the ruling party, but influentially drive pro-poor and pro-working class policy and ideology within the ruling party. One success within this alliance, the ruling alliance, has to be, the Reconstruction and Development Program. I think that's definitely at the height of the success of the alliance coming together, because at its heart, this is a socio-economic plan that is envisaged to eradicate the impacts of apartheid. It had aspirational pillars which included an integrated and sustainable program, a people-driven process, peace and security for all, nation building, linking reconstruction and development, as well as the democratization of South Africa. I mean, the plan is hailed as achieving, and even achieving the status of the electoral manifesto of the ANC leading up to the 1994 election. COSATU then strategically decides that, with the adoption of the RDP as policy within the rank and file of the ANC, they then adopt a policy which I think is now starting to haunt us more than what we would have liked, around swelling the ranks of the government bureaucracy. So the idea is you bring in this very progressive and people-centered program and policy, and then you even take your own people from your own ranks to swell government bureaucracy in an attempt to make this process and this program work. Initially, I mean, this is a good idea, and for those who would have known at the time, 1994, you even had a minister of the RDP, right? Former General Secretary Jane Naidu, to kind of bring about this RDP policy to life, right? As an implementation mechanism. But not too long after, what you then see is that you have this political reality that you now come into after 1994, and it sort of like clashes with a number of economic consequences, right? And this you start to see, especially in the utterances of then Minister of Finance Alec Irwin, who then indicates that, even though the fundamental idea within the RDP was mass economic participation as well as job creation, then Minister says that it's not necessarily going to be as a result of participation within public employment programs, but it's rather going to be a consequence of there being greater participation or job employment within the private sector. And I think in this administration, we're starting to hear that type of rhetoric a lot. And COSATU at the time, in its development of the RDP, makes it clear that job creation is going to be an animal of public sector participation in public employment programs. Another thing that now becomes a consequence is the fact that in the RDP, there was always this insertion that for the RDP to work, you would need 129 billion over 10 years for you to achieve the basics of the RDP. And the then Minister of RDP himself, J. Naidu, says in order for this to happen, you have to expose our government structures to access capital from the market at favorable rates. Now, I think at this point, and this happened short after 1994, at this point you now start to see a fundamental departure from the aspirations and policy program of RDP into something else that I don't think at the time the alliance partners had adequately grappled with then. Needless to say, the ANC then moves in a completely different agenda, introduces gear as a policy, and it forges ahead with a capitalist neoliberal macroeconomic framework, which is basically what you can describe gear as being. In fact, they forge ahead with Cabinet even deciding that it shuts down the Ministry of the RDP. So you could say as early as 1996, there were clear indications that the alliance is not necessarily going to achieve its ideals as envisaged leading up to the 1994 elections. So we should have canned it then, right? But that doesn't happen because to a certain extent, there seems to be mutual benefits from various players within the alliance for this alliance to remain. I mean, there's been significant failures within the alliance to date, and I don't think I have to tell anybody what those clear failures have been. But what it then poses is then what becomes the future of the alliance, and what does it look like in its reconfigured state. I mean, one of the successes, of COSATU, SACP, and the ANC being together, especially within the labor movement, has been the development of the Labor Relations Act, as well as the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. All well and good, but I think one thing you should realize about these very two legislation is that without, and this is something COSATU had always talked about, without a mandatory centralized bargaining, it would be very difficult to even implement, the aspiration of a Labor Relations Act as well as the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. Now, when we come to forums of this nature, it's very easy to come and point a finger in the face of the ANC. It's easy, and sometimes it's a cop-out. But when you look at what has happened to COSATU since the beginning of democracy and how it's changed in terms of its own configuration as a federation, it had a very strong private sector participation within the federation. And I think since the exit of NUMSA in 2015, what you've now started to see is that its identity is now firmly rooted in the public sector. And now more than ever, because the public sector is in its majority, it has to play into public sector politics. The biggest one being when government reneged on Resolution 1 of 2018. I think this is now when we start to see probably the biggest friction in the alliance post the exit of NUMSA in 2015. Now you've got a trade federation, COSATU, which has a mass membership of public sector workers in an alliance with the employer. Now the contradictions are many in that. How do you then have an alliance, but this alliance is not getting you to a point where you can achieve your independence, and it's not getting you to the point where you can win and wage struggles for the workers effectively. I think that's since the 2015 exit of NUMSA, this is probably the biggest issue that COSATU is currently grappling with. So the configuration of COSATU in itself, ever since the dawn of democracy, and the ANC's adoption of capitalism, neoliberalism, and with the SACP being what the SACP is, there's clearly huge contradictions and mass conflicts that are taking place in the alliance currently. So people will say then just reconfigure the alliance. I've heard this term a lot. I've heard it a lot in the last 7 years, this idea of reconfiguring the alliance. You're reconfiguring the alliance to do what? is probably the question that should be answered before you even get into the discussion around reconfiguring the alliance. Are we striving to achieve the rights of workers? Are we striving to achieve, basic and socialist principles for the poor? And I find those discussions to be incredibly lacking, especially in the reconfiguration of the alliance. In fact, when you talk about reconfiguration of the alliance, it seems as though it's reduced to who does COSATU tell workers to vote for on election day? Does it tell them to vote for the SACP or does it tell them to vote for the ANC? Which reduces then the alliance to a voting bloc as opposed to anything else. And I think the problem with that is that coming into the governments of coalitions and coming into a potential within 2024 where the ruling party might have to go into coalitions, then what becomes the role of the SACP and COSATU? Because as it is currently in the Joburg Metro, the ANC has coalitions with the EFF. That's an alliance. What then becomes the role of COSATU? In Tshwane, ANC EFF is colluding together to run that particular metro. That's an alliance. So I think the conversation around the reconfiguration of the alliance, which scares a lot of people, is pushing us to a point where we probably need to see an alliance with different parties, which is a scary issue because, like I said, within an alliance is certain vested interests. I mean, it's not even clear in the COSATU discussions itself what the alliance looks like because, again, those vested interests tend to rear their ugly head. But what experiences are starting to show is that there is a regrouping in our politics. There is a regrouping, and I think the left owes it to itself to regroup. And if it doesn't look like what we've historically known it to look like, I think that's okay. And I think those are the fears that are plaguing itself in the labor movement, in the SACP, not too sure if it does in the ANC. Because the idea is that within an alliance you remain independent, but you are influential in terms of your alliance partner, which is clearly not the case currently in the alliance. In fact, it seems as though the SACP and COSATU are subordinates to the ANC, which is not what an alliance is supposed to be about. So there's definitely, that's why I said this is career limiting, there's definitely a cause for a regrouping of the alliance and not necessarily a reconfiguration of the alliance. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Excellent.
Okay, sure. All right. Thanks, Lebu. Thanks, Basani, and thanks to everyone who came out this evening. So when I got the invitation for the talk, I thought, okay, this is quite exciting. And then at some point I was writing an email to the organizers thinking, oh, I won't make it because, I'm joining the shutdown. And then I did try to join the shutdown, but in my neck of the woods there wasn't much action. So yeah, I'm here tonight and I'm very happy to be here. I appreciate that this talk is organized around a number of principles, and one of those is being frank, while also being cordial with each other, being non-sectarian. I appreciate that, being non-sectarian, but also being humble, and admitting that we don't have all the answers or even most of the answers. And that's where I'm coming from in terms of my input. I must say, and maybe declare up front, that I spent the best of my youth years in the Alliance, or in Alliance politics. So I was in the Young Communist League, I was in SASCO, I was in the ANC Youth League, on campus, beyond campus. I got expelled at the age of 24. I struggled to find myself for a few years, and then I moved to Cape Town, where I did very exciting things with young, exciting people who are politically engaged, but not necessarily in political parties. And so part of what I'll be reflecting on draws from the best of those years, but also the best of my years in Cape Town, with activists in Cape Town. So in preparing for this talk tonight, I found it a bit difficult to organize my thoughts without starting with where we are today. So we are probably just over 12 months away from what will be 30 years of democracy. And if you speak to many people today, but they say, but this is a democracy that was ushered in, at least with the promise of a better life for all. And most of us, although admitting that a lot has changed, but we're also very quick to admit that this is not a society that generations and generations of activists who came before us fought for. This is a society that has levels of crisis, that has crisis at different levels, wherever you go. And my talk tonight is not so much about the crisis. I'm going to try and be hopeful, but it's necessary to sort of touch on the crisis that despite 3 decades of democracy, we've got landlessness, we've got inequality, we've got exploitation, we've got rabid racism, and endemic violence, which is also gendered in many ways. We've got corruption, and we've got the collapse, a wholesale collapse of public services in many places. In fact, my article this weekend in the Sunday Times was talking about how the ANC is presiding over the collapse of public services, especially local government, which I hope we will sort of touch on it. So with that recognition that this society is a far cry from what generations have fought for, I would say that this reality has given rise to a number of questions, big questions. The biggest question of all is, of course, this question around the legitimacy of the democratic order. With many activists today, many ordinary people today feeling like if democracy can't resolve the daily contradictions that I face and the conditions of everyday life, then what is the point? And I think there's something very dangerous in that, in that question. The question is valid, but there are some dangers. And these dangers, I suppose, for me, or these dangers and possibilities give rise to three responses. The first response is that there is a possibility, if it's not already happening, when we look at the statistics, where ordinary people sort of retreat from politics and no longer see politics as emancipatory practice, right? But see politics as an elite project, the project of the big men, such as we saw today with Jimmy Mani, Mzwanele Mani, or Carl Hayes and whatever, but politics as being predominantly an elite project and not something that we can use to effect change and to liberate ourselves. Some people say the 2021 local government elections, where there was an actual stay away to some extent from the polls, is an indication of this, where you had 40 million eligible voters, but only 12 million actually showed up at the polls. Many people deciding to stay home, do the laundry, look after the kids, and get on with the everyday business, but not the business of showing up at the polls. Only 20% of young people between the ages of 20 and 35 years registered to vote in 2019, right? And then, of course, many people have low levels of trust in mainstream political parties, in politicians, and so on. In fact, young people today just say, "Maragafana." What's the point? It's all the same anyway. Why must I participate in this act? And of course, democracy is not just about voting. And I'll go into this at the end, but there are some strong indications there. So that's possibility number one. For me, number two, I think there's a growing belief that change can only come through strong men. And by strong men, so an authoritarian, messianic figure who gets things done. And if he's wearing military uniform, all the better, even more appealing. So this masculinist militarism of men who get things done, who don't have time for ideology, who are pragmatic and they get things done. Mashaba doesn't wear that uniform, but Mashaba can also fit into that description. So the strong appeal of some of these figures resides, like I'm saying, in their ability to get things done or being perceived as being able to get things done. Look at Gayton and all of that. Whether it's sorting out the issue of borders, or whether it's responding to the question of jobs and fixing swimming pools that no longer work and all of that, right? And then the third response is not positive as well. This is a response now within sections of the ANC. You might have heard it in the run-up to the conference, this NASREC 2.0, where people were actually saying the reason why we've got this crisis in society is because we've got the 11 judges of the Constitutional Court who are now, who have ascended above politics and political life. So leaders get elected, but they don't have power. The judges are the dictators, and therefore what we need is a parliamentary democracy. We must dispense with this constitutional democracy and this constitution, which is a hindrance to radical change and radical reform. So Sihle Zikalala was saying that everywhere, Lindiwe Sisulu was saying that, and many other people were actually sharing that sentiment, which I think is a third possibility. I'm citing all of these things because my own perspective is that the ANC has presided over the crisis that we face in society today. Not only presided, it's a signatory and an underwriter to the crisis that we face in South African society today, through policies that have decimated the working class in a big ways, policies that have decimated labor, policies that have eroded working class living standard, either by commodifying basic services or different things, or dealing with jobs and all of that, but eroding working class living standards. And the crisis of corruption can also not be divorced from the ANC itself. And of course, this crisis has led to a credibility crisis for public services and public provisioning. So the distrust of politics, narrowly defined, is also extended to the SACP in big ways. And I was really hoping that we'd have somebody from the SACP at least present here, because I don't like to talk about people in their absence. But the SACP is also painted with the same colors, but for slightly different reasons. Similar but different reasons. Some of the reasons include the SACP's historic divisive role in internal union battles, right, over leadership. Interfering with democracy, choosing certain sides, and all of that, and painting others who contest in very wrong ways, in very undemocratic ways. The SACP leadership today, as it stands, doesn't reflect society, actually. It's not a mirror of society. So if you look at who sits in the Central Committee of the SACP, you have less than 30% are women, or a third, only a third are women. When most organizations are talking about 50%, the zebra approach and all of that, you struggle to find women in the leadership of the SACP. You struggle to find people who are young in the leadership of the SACP. You struggle to find people who are rooted in queer community struggles or advancing those struggles, or even organizations outside of them. So it doesn't reflect what South African society looks like and what people in struggle actually look like. So that's the second thing. The SACP historically has had a very dismissive attitude towards movements or other movements that are rights-based, that might not have the language of socialism and all of that, but are fighting for everyday needs and practical needs of people. They've been very dismissive in the past over such movements and painted them in very problematic ways, especially during the Zuma era. And of course, the SACP was loyal to Zuma and the Zuma project until the very end, almost 2 years before Zuma was removed or forced to resign to the SACP actually switched side. All the time throughout, they were calling even for laws to punish people who are critical of Zuma and all of that. So very undemocratic in its approach. Of course, leading cadres of the SACP are currently enacting and implementing decisions that are unfavorable to the working class, and you see this throughout the years. And perhaps I think most importantly, the SACP's response to Marikana. I think all of us are familiar to that, are familiar with that, so I won't go into detail, but I think those are just some of the reasons. So rightfully, the SACP's 14th, I'm coming to the topic now, the 14th and 15th Congress resolution that the alliance, not the alliance, the resolution on the left popular front is viewed with suspicion, right, from various quarters of society. For these reasons. But this idea of a left popular front, according to the SACP, speaks mainly to two things. There's this idea of electoral possibility, so contesting, but there's also this idea of intensified mass struggles working with other organizations and movements that are largely not very trustful of the SACP. And one or the other is emphasized depending on what is convenient. So sometimes there's the threat of contesting and going it alone, and then sometimes it's about, no, let's run mass campaigns, similar to the campaign on the financial sector, reform, and all of that, and let's win immediate demands and all of that. I won't go into this question of a Reconfigured Alliance, which is the second thing that the SACP sort of throws into the mix, but that's really about decision-making within the alliance, right? Who deploys, how deployment is made, and maybe a little bit about policy. The critique that often emerges from some of us is that the SACP is instrumentalist in its approach to movements and popular struggles, and often behaves as if it's got a monopoly of legitimacy over working class struggles. And these examples that I've given just now about how in the past some movements were painted with whether they're called counter-revolutionary or anti-majoritarian and so forth, is part of that. But also that the SACP lacks sincerity most of the time, so it's quick to dump a position as soon as the ANC accommodates party cadres. So sometimes there's a feeling that even this idea of going it alone is used as leverage to sort of threaten the ANC or to whip the ANC into line. What I've said so far may lead one to believe that I don't see a place for the alliance or alliance formations in the future that we're talking about when this discussion is about the future. I must say that I do take, and perhaps because of my early activism, I do take the social base of the ANC and the SACP very seriously. I don't ignore the fact that the SACP claims a membership of 400,000 people in different parts. I don't ignore that. The social composition of that membership is another question. And by that I mean the class composition of that membership is another question, but I take that membership seriously. And so, my parting short, talking about the future, has a number. I'm returning to those 3 points I made earlier about some of the dangers, the retreat from politics and all of that. And what I want to say is that I think there is a need to reclaim politics as emancipatory practice. I think there is a need to expand what it means to be political and not have an exclusionary notion of politics. And so I want to leave us with a number of questions. The first one, what does left political strategy look like? And where do elections feature into this? I know the left sometimes is quite obsessed. We are quite obsessed with elections. And I'm going to be controversial now and say that we do need to do some stock taking about previous attempts on the ballot, whether it was WASP, whether it's SRWP, whether it's the United Front, Comrade Trevor, and so on. There is a need there's a need to sort of have a frank chat about left political strategy. And linked to that, what does a left political instrument look like? I think there is a critique that is coming up now that says that the left is obsessed with the political party as the only political instrument for change, whereas when you look elsewhere, the idea of a political instrument can take different forms. So what is that? What is that different form? Especially, I mean, if there are talks now about forming something almost over 12 months, let's say less than 12 months away from an election or slightly over 12 months, we need to talk about that and be frank about what failure at the ballot sometimes, how that sometimes contributes to cynicism at future experiments. The third question, who forms part of the revolutionary subject today? Given how capitalism has changed, I think most of us now are sort of grappling with that question. So there are young people in waithood, which is, people are saying it's a suspended place between childhood and adulthood, but these young people who lack the markers of adulthood, who can't move out of home, who can't get an education, who can't get a job, and there's about 9 million of these young people. In parts of Cape Town, these young people are occupying land and they're building shacks and contesting a very divided city. Is that part of the revolutionary subject? And so on. I could go on and on with that, but let me just leave that question there. What does it mean to have a left that gets things done? I spoke about how the right can get things done, and by that I don't mean you must dump ideology or dump the battle of ideas. But what the women in Bonneville did when they started a soup kitchen, and they called it kitchen assemblies, and they were feeding the community every day, and afterwards organizing and talking about issues of violence, of gangsterism and all of that. That's my idea of getting things done without dumping ideas and dumping ideology. I think that we also need a new vocabulary to fit into today's changing times, and we might want to think about that a little bit more. And then I'll conclude by saying that I've raised this before, that we do need a left that sort of values creativity and hope. I've spent a lot of time talking about what is wrong and what, but I do think there is value in talking about hope and in the act of dreaming. And if you will allow me, I'll just be very quick, 30 seconds. There is a book I'm currently reading, and I'm reading all these books about dreaming because in my earlier years, we were told that if you dream too much, that's idealist, you must be concrete, and you must be material in analyzing society and all of that. There's scientific laws that are working in society, and dreaming is not a revolutionary act, but there are feminists, there are popular educators, there are revolutionaries like the likes of Robin Kelly who are talking about dreaming and writing about what it means to dream, but also locating that historically that we come from a heritage of people who actually did dream about possibility and what the future could sort of look like. So this book that I'm reading, the author says, yes, it is common to fear ridicule when we talk about dreaming. In our society, dreamers are often believed to be failures or people who don't get things done. Students are often told to stop daydreaming and get to work. The popular and sarcastic phrase, dream on, suggests that a particular idea or desire is impossible or will never happen. Instead, those who fear the ridicule of a society that defines rationality narrowly will call it envisioning or imagining. Yet dreaming is not always as we've been made to believe. That is pure fantasy. Our dreams are often reconfigurations of what already exists in the world, and thus plausible alternatives to the way things are. And I'm reading that because I think there's a way in which the crisis in South Africa today can conscript our imagination and imprison our imagination such that we don't see a future beyond the alliance, beyond the ANC, and beyond the wreckage. But through dreaming, we can sort of get there. Thanks.
Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks to both Lebogang and Pandila for those comments, I think, which were both very useful. Just as a preface to my engagement, when the introduction of myself, I need to locate myself a little bit more outside of the intellectual terrain of the writer. As some of you might know, from the 80s onwards, I was in the Alliance. First of all, in the ANC in exile, a little bit of underground work, and then in the Communist Party full-time for almost 10 years before I was expelled in 2000, 23 years ago. And then a co-founder of the Anti-Privatization Forum, which was one of the social movements, and then the Right to Know campaign. So what I have to say, and my analysis, is grounded in activism, is grounded not simply in a battle of ideas and contestation of intellectual engagement, but as an activist as well. And I'm going to try in the short space of time to cover quite a bit of ground, because I'm going to want to look at some of the macro perspectives. I think a lot of the others have been covered in the context of the more practical realities of the present. I think it's very important for us to first understand, I think, the nature of the Alliance and the ANC and the ideological and strategic character. So for those who broadly, within the ANC and the Alliance, who broadly align themselves with that alliance, the strategic approach that I would argue that sees power as residing in existent institutional forms, i.e. the state, existent forms of political representation and participation, i.e. the party and elections, and with those who have existent ownership of capital, i.e. the capitalist class. So my analysis is that the entire strategic trajectory, right from the time, and in fact, one of the reasons why I got expelled from the SACP was because in 1995 I'd written a book that basically traced the ANC from 1912 all the way through, and I argued that the ANC leadership had already abandoned the people, was already going to use the mass of the people for a particular class and other interests at that particular point, precisely because the strategic approach was one of accession and incorporation. Accession of institutional power and incorporation into existent power. And therefore the mass was simply a tap to be turned on and off, to be used when necessary. In other words, a strategy that valorizes and is embedded within the foundational status quo of power, i.e. capitalism. Simple as that. This is what constitutes what I call the state party capital power matrix that has become the engine room of South Africa's post-1994 journey, and which has now embedded itself with much of the labor, worker, union movement and particularly the Communist Party for many years now. Flowing from this strategy is a tactical approach. One of the criticisms that I've always had of the left is an inability to distinguish between strategy and tactics, and a confusion between the two things. And therefore, a tactic becomes strategy. So you said, you know, it basically, but the strategy that I've just outlined, the tactical approach that flows from that, is framed by a particular static reading of the existing balance of forces. Practically what this has meant is it translated into a macro politics and a governance that has demanded a turn away from the people and towards accession and incorporation into the framework of, as I said, existent power as the dominant servicing of associated class interests. Once that tactical choice was made, which I argue was made in the 1980s, way before CODESA, way before the negotiations, way before this time, that decision had already been made by the ANC leadership and increasingly by the Communist Party leadership, but to a lesser extent. Once that choice had been made, and the state, as the core political source of power, was captured in 1994, there was a natural convergence of interest between the ANC, the Alliance, and those who already held and controlled the core sources of economic power, i.e. corporate capital. The same can be applied to most unions and the labor movement as a whole. That's the one side. The other side, which is completely often ignored in this discussion, is the personal. The personal is political. So what we look at is we look at the structural, we look at the organizational, we look at the big picture, but we do not look at what has happened and why left politics has been so delegitimized. Because people have simply not practiced what they have preached. People can see through hypocrites time and time again. They can see through liars time and time again. And we can see it doesn't matter whether it was 30 years ago or whether it's just now, where people are claiming a particular left and radical politics, and in their personal lives do exactly the opposite. It's simply unacceptable to have, and this is the thing that the left has lost, and a lot of left forces have lost, is they've made a Chinese wall between these two things. So a male can get up on a platform and say, "Viva the working class, viva everything," and then go and emotionally and physically abuse his partner at the end of the day, and get away with it and nobody questions it. And that is a problem fundamentally. So if we look at the situation in the last 30, 40 years, we must link the big picture to the smaller one, the political to the personal. Whatever the structural realities, balance of forces, positions of leadership and power, it's the people who have changed themselves. They have allowed themselves to be lured by power and money, to be sucked in by the prize of capturing institutional power, and seduced by the egotism and lifestyles of the capitalist elite. I mean, just look at it. You know, people are selling their souls. The other day I was reading that one of the guys who's just been fingered in corruption on the water board sold his vote and sold for a Jaguar. That was it. That was pretty much the cost. It was a Jaguar, whatever it is, how many billions, how many millions. Basic ethics and values of honesty, respect, humility, accountability, empathy, responsibility, solidarity, and generosity that informed the huge personal sacrifices and collective moral power of the liberation struggle have been largely forgotten and cast aside. This, to me, is the most fundamental lesson. We can preach the politics all we want. We can come up with strategies all we want. But if we do not show the example of our politics in the way we live and the way we lead and the way we organize and the way we struggle, people will not come on that journey. They simply will not. They'll see through it fairly quickly. And they have. They've seen through it time and time and time again. And then people wonder what the problem is in that context. So what does this mean for the strategic and tactical options going forward in terms of the left? I'm not going to cover a lot of the character of the alliance and all the different components of it, what's happened over the last 30 years. I think we've covered a lot of that. The first thing I would argue that is most fundamentally first step, besides trying to look at the personal political, is that we must start by positively asserting and reclaiming the individual and collective ability of workers, the poor, the broad working class, however we want to say that, to change the country and the world which we now inhabit. It seems very, very simple, but it's fundamental. We have lost, I believe, fundamentally the ability to convince people they have the power to change things. They have the power to change things in their community, they have the power to change things in their household, they have the power to change things in their province, in their country, and in the world. When you don't believe you have the power to change something, then what happens? Your politics become totally defensive. They become an anti-politics. which is something that the social movements and others who came after 2000 in particular have always struggled with. Issue movements and anti-politics, where do you go beyond just fighting for a particular space, which is important, fighting to defend a line. It's fundamentally important, so it's not to dismiss those struggles in the least. It's to try to say that we have to move beyond them and to believe again that we have the power to do that. Now, this might sound simplistic, but at the heart of the present realities of class warfare and struggle is the general loss of belief in our capacity and ability to build an inclusive anti-capitalist movement, an inclusive gender-based movement, inclusive of LGBTIQ+, and inclusive of all sorts of different kinds of people with different colors, with different sexualities, with different genders, with everything else. And I'm sorry to say that the traditional left is a dinosaur left in that context. There's still a machoism, there's still a male misogyny, a patriarchy that dominates the politics. And it's almost as if you create the gender wing, you create the youth wing, you can see that within the alliance is how it's done. And I'm sure people like Level Hang and others have felt this within the context of being. I know I felt it even as privileged as I am as a white male as well, which I could never even begin to contemplate what it meant for others in that context. So I think that's the first step. Then we have to move, I think, beyond what I would call a strategic impasse. What the strategic impasse of the left, and I use this in the broadest sense possible, is the effective institutionalism of an anti-politics, grounded in essentially reactive, issue-based, and personality-driven strategic framework, the big person, the big man in particular, as the best means to confront capital, engage the state, mobilize the mass, and transform social power and relations under capitalism. While this kind of politics can and does provide an ongoing vehicle for left activism, it can only go so far. It's essentially a defensive politics. As such, the South African left, in the broad sense, has been taken, and we still are, with fighting rearguard battles. We are defending space. That's what we're doing. Yeah. We are not moving forward to show a vision to society that says, hey, by the way, here's an alternative that you can build around. In the broader sense, there are components of that. There are small examples of that, but not on a larger scale, which is the big challenge. So this, in turn, has seriously obscured the possibilities of those implicitly anti-capitalist struggles that are taking place every day, everywhere. The left oftentimes sees, and I was a victim to this, it's the big march, it's the big event, it's the big revolution, it's the storming of the Bastille. If it's not that, it's not revolutionary. Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. And the most revolutionary things that I've seen in this country over 35 years is at the local level, of people just doing very simple things, very anti-capitalist things, very alternative kinds of things. And if the left had to take those things seriously and organize around them and build that up from the base, if we're serious about groundedness and bottom-up politics, that to me has to be a fundamental pillar to that kind of politics. And coterminous with that is the practical side, creches, food gardens, all sorts of things that begin to allow people to exit the capitalist, social, and political and economic relations, while at the same time offering and beginning to debate ideas and offering some kind of alternative vision, a socialist politics, whatever we want to call it, something that is anti-capitalist. So you combine the two. They're not separate. The debate doesn't take place amongst intellectuals in the left in big conferences and other things. It's down at the ground in the context of what that means and pulling those things together. That's the one thing. So I would argue that in South Africa over the last many years, the left has tended to either gravitate towards this issue-based anti-politics, often strategically conceptualized as a struggle for revolutionary reforms. You know, we're not trying to overthrow capitalism, we're trying to create spaces. Fair enough. That's one particular strategic and sort of way. Or to seek refuge, and here's the other problem with the traditional left, and I would argue with the other outside of the alliance left, and I'm being as critical and self-introspective here, is the classical arms of the vanguard. The vanguard. We are the vanguard, we have the program, we have the power, we'll tell you what it is. If you just follow our flag, we've got the line. And this is still embedded within, I believe, left mentality, this vanguardism, that what you have to do is you have to get those that are the most advanced section, and you have to drive through and convince, and you pull people to your party, you pull people to your program, you pull them in. This has failed time and time and time and time again, precisely because there is no organic connection between the two. There's no organic. It's an instrumentalist connection. It is a power connection that engages. So I would argue that then informs us of the kind of, I'm not here to provide answers, but I want to just use the last few minutes of my time to talk about where we might want to, a way forward in that context, with very general kinds of perspectives without being prescriptive, because I fundamentally have come to believe, and I've learned my personal lessons and political lessons over 40 years, made mistakes, been part of vanguards, been part of these things, and tried to find a way through these things that is reflective, that is serious, while at the same time trying to be true to the idea of something different, to an anti-capitalist politics. So I would argue that we are now in an epoch, in South Africa and many other places, where the struggles of the broad working class, and I mean that in the broadest sense, are increasingly necessarily framed by an anti-capitalist spirit, if not content, even if it's not theorized in that way. I think it's there. While there continues to be activist and popular confusion over what exactly is and is not capitalist, or is not socialist, or whatever, it's quite clear that there's concrete struggles that are taking place against privatization, socialized provision of housing, water, electricity, basic foodstuff, land, contesting capital, are aimed at contesting capitalist relations of ownership and distribution. These must be embraced as revolutionary, as absolutely essential to the building of a broad-based mass movement, which I would argue does not and should not at this stage take the party form at all. If we want to recycle past failures, then do the same thing again and again and again. Given that there also continues to be much confusion over what constitutes socialism, or it is all the more imperative for those that consider themselves to be on the left and socialist, not only to catalyze such struggles through practical involvement in those forms, but to win the idea politically that what is desperately needed and indeed demanded is the organizational recognition and expression through mass struggles and through forms of those things as socialist or as anti-capitalist. In other words, we need to be clear about what kind of politics we're offering and what kind of politics is being fought for, without being too prescriptive. That's a difficult ask. Meeting this challenge provides a potential means for overcoming the strategic divide that I previously mentioned, forging a practical unity amongst broad left forces, and moving beyond what has become a stale and misdirected debate in South Africa around whether or not we're going to have a workers' party, or another party, another party, another party, another party, whatever you want to call it. And I think that is, we've got to get out of it. It's a trench, it's a rut. You've got to move out and look up. And sometimes it's a difficult thing to do because in that context. So it should be more than clear, going back to the Alliance, that there are those within the mass base, and there always have been those within the mass base who vote, who are precisely the people that I'm talking about. It's not about Joe Ramaphosa. It's not about all the ministers. It's not about the elites within it. This is precisely what has always been the case. Going all the way back to 1940s, when Dr. A.B. Bluma was the General Secretary of the ANC at the time, was asked in 1949, is the ANC an anti-capitalist organization? His response at the time was, as long as capitalism exists, the struggle of the ANC is to make our fair share within the capitalist system. 1949. That's what the General Secretary of the ANC said, and I would argue that that has not changed for that elite. Where the rank and file are, they're looking. There's people that are looking for alternatives, and the gap is big. The possibilities are endless. And so, as opposed to being pessimistic, as opposed to being everything is hopelessness and everything is there are all sorts of possibilities that exist to take our politics, to remake it, to reconfigure it without having all the answers. And I think that's what we have to admit. And to forge within the struggle and within the time those kinds of things. And to be confident that ordinary people themselves understand the most, much better than many others, middle class and upper middle class, do about what those real struggles are and how we try to go about them. Listening, learning, organize, struggle. Thank you.
You know, Lebogang took us on a journey of like the history of the Alliance and some of its contradictions. And one contradiction you speak about is one that Dale spoke about earlier, which is fundamental around the politics of ascension, of abandoning the masses to ascend into state operation structures, and the implications of that you give an example of the RDP, right? So that kind of like co-option has always been, is the undercurrent of what has like undermined the ANC. I mean, not the ANC, but it's the COSATU and its independence within the alliance. And then you speak about like a contradiction that confounds the COSATU, which is being an alliance as an independent broker with the employer, right? That being the ANC, and not being able to use that leverage to ensure that the implementation of, you know, the wage agreement. You then speak about what is then and how an alliance is reduced towards like electoral politics rather than what Panelist speaks about, like daily emancipation, political emancipation. So when you say that the alliance needs to be reconfigured, right, in a way that moves away from COSATU's and the SACP's subordination within the alliance, what do you mean practically about that? What is it that, what would be required for, how do you see, what is the outlook for a reconfigured alliance where the COSATU is actually effective in ensuring that its demands are met within that alliance?
So I don't call for the reconfiguration of the alliance.
Oh,
right?
I thought that's what you said.
Yeah, it's not me. It's not me, but it's been the stance of the alliance partners, and for them, I think it's a sort of like an attempt to regain their independence. That's how I hear the conversation unfolding. But in practical terms, and given what has been the case between the relationship between the alliance partners and the state, I struggle to see the reconfiguration of the alliance in the historical sense of what the alliance currently looks like. For me, I don't think it can be reconfigured within the way that it currently looks. For me, it looks like, you know, they like saying this, and I hate that I'm using this term here, but it's literally moving chairs in a sinking ship, right? Regardless of how you reorientate them, at its core, you know, there needs to be I believe a shift in what it is we intended the alliance to work for. What is the common purpose of the alliance? And if you are able to significantly answer that question, it then says, okay, can I create a mass movement, and which organizations do I need to incorporate to be able to achieve that end? And I think there isn't an appetite currently to have that type of conversation, because what you are essentially doing is rewriting the alliance, and you are you changing it completely, meaning that you might not necessarily have an ANC or have an SACP within that particular alliance. So the broader conversation, currently the reconfiguration discussion to me is happening at a very limited scale. And it's limited in the sense that, again, I think the co-panelists have already talked about it, this idea of sort of the voting or electoral power, as opposed to the purpose of having an alliance and what struggle is the alliance meant to be configured in order to defeat. I think at the fundamental level, there isn't a clear understanding of what struggle brings the current alliance together. There's a huge contradiction in terms of that, right? So the COSATU will tell you that it's firmly rooted in anti-privatization. And then you've got an ANC that does what? Entrenches privatization. And then I'm not, like you said, it's difficult to talk about the SACP when they are not here. So those are the fundamental contradictions that you see playing themselves out. For me, the reconfiguration doesn't currently look like the three current parties that are in alliance together. And that's honestly, and to be quite honest, this reconfiguration, like I said when I was making my input, is already playing itself out in local government, where it's not necessarily the ANC, SACP and COSATU, but it's the ANC with other political parties. So it looks different, and I think that's the difficult idea that people are struggling to grapple with, that within the reconfiguration of an alliance, it does not necessarily mean the three still remain together in a bloc as the tripartite.
And then I wanted to get to you, Dale, quickly before I move to Pindile. You know, you spoke about the ANC having kind of like being a bourgeoisie party, basically, since, you know, pre-94, and abandoning the masses, right? And there have been, it has, at least some of the ANC would say that the problem is not the ANC, but rather is those who move into government. There's this gap between what the ANC's program and then the government's program, right? And there's this big schism between the two. And then they would argue that, in fact, you know, the political program is that which actually represents the base that you speak about, right? But the problem is then when they move into government, like there is this schism. And I'm wondering if that has any legitimacy within your frame of analysis, or has that gap actually been narrowed? Are the two, if we think about like the programmatic work, the policies, right? Are the two actually singing from the same hymn sheet, or are those who defend themselves within the ANC to say, actually, we do have this programmatic thing, but in government, like, you know, there's a difference between the Thuli House and where the presidency situates itself.
Sure, that is a important argument and one that has been made. I would fundamentally disagree with the argument. I don't think it holds a great deal of water, and I'll tell you why. Because fundamentally, if the ANC, if you're going to sustain that argument, and you're going to say it's the ANC is okay, we've got good policies, we've got good, then if you had an organization that reflected the will of its own membership, then you would be forcing your political representatives, and you would hold them to account and to implement those policies. You wouldn't be helpless in the face and saying, oh, well, people go into government and cabinet can do whatever they want, and the Ramaphosa can do whatever they want, because they're now no longer answering to the ANC, they're answering to the nation, right? So that's the problem, is the gap is not so much between policy and between in the state and the ANC. It's a fundamental gap between the leadership and the rank and file. And also between, and this is, I mentioned lifestyle. One of the fundamental mistakes of the ANC, one of the most fundamental mistakes of the ANC right after it captured power in 1994, if people remember, was the Remuneration Commission, which set government salaries of public servants. And what they did right from the beginning was, you become a minister, you become this, and you become wealthy. And so therefore, politics is about trying to access those positions. Everybody's fighting to get to that position. You get to the branch secretary, you become the branch secretary, you get onto the NEC, you get onto the PEC, then you go and you start stepping the ladder, and you can also own, and you can live there, and you can have that lifestyle, and you can do these things. So the entire trajectory of the party, basically, whether or not it's intended by the rank and file is not the point. It's basically made to the point where it's about accessing that state power, accessing that class power, accessing that material power. And imagine if the ANC had said right from the beginning that all public servants, and I know Trevor here, remember this debate that we had about when, okay, it was like, you earn a worker's salary, or you earn something that is basically at least at the level of the ordinary person. Right? Everybody's laughing. No, how can you do that? I work for an organization, Ilrig, right now, where everyone gets paid exactly the same, from the cleaner to myself with a PhD and 35 years of experience and jobs. We all get paid the same. And people say, how can you do that? Well, we say, we try to basically make it. If we're serious about non-hierarchical politics, about equality, then we must practice it within the organization. And that's the problem, is the ANC has failed fundamentally to put those principles and value to work within the organization. So then when the state comes, of course it's going to create the gap. Of course it's going to do these things. It's a natural progression of these things. And then people are fighting it constantly to say, let's get rid of the corrupt thing. Let's get rid of those people. Or and then you're constantly fighting defensive and you're putting out fires as opposed to a transformative vision. I hope that maybe answers the question in some ways.
Thank you. And then, Pindile, I want to almost pose the brilliant questions you had, at least one of them, to you, which is, what does it mean for a left to get things done? Which is like fundamental as we are thinking to you.
Yes, I mean, so I don't have the answer, right? But I gave one example about what happened during lockdown. I think there are possibly more examples like that, where, I mean, this example that I'm giving was literally women coming together every Saturday in a kitchen in a community that was facing hunger, because when the lockdown came, you remember there was no cushioning whatsoever for the working class. So these women came together every Saturday to cook, but after feeding this entire community, the women sat down and actually started discussing political issues, whether it's gangsterism in the area, whether should they field a candidate for the 2021 local government elections, whether it's questions around youth in Waitrose and all of that. And there are plenty of these examples, right, historically. A lot of people like quoting or going back to the Black Panther Party's breakfast program. Today we'll probably dismiss some of those as charity, but I'm not talking about charity. I'm talking about prefigurative politics and getting things done, responding to the question of insecurity, because we walk into politics coming from different homes and all of that, and this question of food insecurity in South Africa is big. And so if people are to come together, they must come together while also being cushioned against. So some of those, I'm sure there are plenty of examples like that, but this getting things done for me is not a mashaba type of getting things done, or being pragmatic and then saying, let's leave politics aside, let's leave ideas. For me, that is political in very real ways.
So my name is Dimitri. I'm a freelance environmental journalist, and we touched on climate at the beginning of this talk and haven't actually gone any deeper into it. So one of my questions is how, I suppose, beyond the alliance, the left in general, so I think this has been quite a big critique of the left in terms of sidelining the environment. What opportunities does both the climate crisis as well as the biodiversity crisis provide left politics? But beyond that, how can the left also integrate a lot of knowledge systems which are usually outside of, the Marxist conception of the environment and how to engage with it? We're talking about territoriality in terms of the land being much more than just a productive asset. There's a lot more to the land and the people and the environment than just these productive assets. So how could the left move beyond what is currently done relating to the environment and biodiversity? So I think there's a lot of talk around climate crisis being able to create jobs, and there's green power, but I think there's a lot more to this crisis than just that. And I mean, looking at also the food gardens example, I mean, why isn't there a movement of food gardens, especially when we do have these intersecting issues and profound hunger and unemployment and inequality? Why aren't there more food gardens and a movement of them? Thank you.
I'm Jeremy Daphne. I just want to share a little slice of history. If you look at my age, I've got lots of history in me. And it's so hard sitting here listening with all kinds of memories getting triggered and swirled to the point it gets quite confusing. But I'd just like to share, I thought you might be interested. I was at the second COSATU Congress as a Kawuza organizer. And I belonged to a group that opposed the formation of the alliance there. And I'm still proud I did that. And that group have got together again, and they're starting a new project now, which you'll hear about. It's called Telling Our Own History. The arguments put forward at that Congress 100 years ago, we made about 3 basic points. I won't repeat them here, but I'll give you a hint. The one was non-sectarianism. And I believe those points apply until today. They've held true. What really depresses me, I can't believe it. It's amazing that this alliance even exists. Oh my goodness. No. Please. The fact that we're having a discussion on this is somewhat depressing. It's necessary, but I really wasn't going to come. And if it wasn't for some of my comrades here, I thought, oh no, I better come. It's a nice evening. But really, this is depressing. It is so goddamn depressing. Sorry to swear. It's so simple. Get rid of this bloody alliance. Please. It's ridiculous. How come COSATU has stuck in this so long? I was in COSATU for 18 years. Or something like that. I just wanted to also share the discussion about the Reconstruction Development Program. I would take the demise of COSATU as a radical organization representing the world of the working class, especially women. Even further back, I was in the RDP committee where we discussed the RDP. And it's no big deal, there are other people who were there too. That's not my point. But I was in the Congress, the RDP Congress, and a radical RDP was approved there. Boy, oh my goodness. Once COSATU met with the ANC and the SACP, that was the end of the RDP, straight away. Long before, that was the end. And that was the end of COSATU's role as an emancipatory organization. That far back. That goes back to 1929 for the ANC. But I still remember the RDP discussion and how depressing it was. And then lastly, I fully empathize with what has been said. Except, how can you call our new movement, such as ILRI, a motley group? No. You did at the beginning. I took no, please. I would like to sentence you to meeting the motley group. Okay, one can criticize it, but until recently I worked for Benchmarks Foundation. Wow, the layer of activists there, I'm not talking about the bureaucrats sitting in the office. Wow, they're not a motley group. ILRI, what they're doing now, read Fruits of Our Labour, for example. Dale's going to give me a free drink of this. No, in another life I worked for ILRI as well. There's a new movement. I challenge anyone to debate me on it. There's a new dynamic movement in this country. Anti-capitalist, feminist. Of course, people are not walking around saying, I'm a feminist. But my last point, and thank you for giving me this airtime, is I get the impression we, unlike in the past, we've lost our internationalist focus, which Ulrich has again. There hasn't been, I seldom see mention of our internationalist focus. COSATU now and internationalism, no. There used to be an internationalist, maybe there is still. Oh, there is, okay. But learning from what's happening elsewhere, instead of gazing at our own navels, please, what's happening in Latin America, it gives me hope, it gives me inspiration, and not the only place. Just make a study one country like Colombia. Oh my goodness, what an exciting country. We've got so much to learn there. And it's all about getting out of the party political system, getting into organizing civil society. So building mass movement, mass space, putting our energies there. And COSATU, if you really want to play a role, get out of that alliance and join the new mass movement. At the moment, that alliance, I suggest, is part of the elite bubble. It's part of the motley crowd. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'd be interested to hear the other two principles of that meeting. You mentioned non-sectarianism. I'd be interested to hear the other two. There's another question that you're welcome. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I don't think I'm going to be as articulate as my comrade Jeremy, but I was also in that Congress, and I was on the other side. But I believed in the same thing. I believed in non-sectarianism. I believed in a movement that gave respect to the rank and file. I believed in class struggle, which, by the way, let's not throw away now with all these old things, but it's the hands of workers that make everything. You're sitting on something made by the hands of workers, this building, the wine that we're drinking, everything. Automation, AI, all these fancy stuff has not changed that. And there's still workers in the union, Jeremy. There's not just a new movement. There's an old movement. Okay, some of it's a bit old, you know. I agree. And that's a problem. We need to attract the youth, whatever. I wanted to appreciate the issue of dreaming and vision. You know, sometimes I don't like that word vision. It's too tied to corporates and whatever. But there's a whole theorization in it. I think it goes beyond just, you've got it from the feminine literature. It also comes from other types of Marxist literatures. Let's dream. It's okay to daydream. That's not when you're asleep and you're dreaming and you're unconscious. A daydream is conscious. You know, you can tap into it, and that psychology, to link to Dale's point with the personal, I think is important. I wanted to sort of salute Lerato, but
We work in the
she
same
mustn't report me to the hierarchy. Because I do think there's an honesty in what she says, you know, and a youthful kind of reflection. I just want to say one thing though about maybe the alliance, the tripartite. To me, the problem is the bosses and the capitalists. I don't want to just be anti-capitalist. I want to think of an alternative, and I cannot think of an alternative if even the politics of the SACP is I must collaborate or work with the bosses. It doesn't make sense to me. So to me, it's not just the tripartite, the alliance, the ANC. It's about getting rid of bosses' politics in all of our organizations. Lastly, I just want to go back to the LRA and the BCA. If you look at the most recent public sector strike, in other words, COSATU dominated by the public sector, what held it back? I'll tell you what it was. It was the LRA and essential services. So there's nothing victory about that. That's a bit of propaganda to go into the elections. I wonder if COSATU is going to go into the election saying, well, what victories did we get? BCA, where a security guard who used to get 8 hours work plus overtime now gets 12 hours and that's normal time. That's not a victory, comrades. That is not a victory. So, we need to go back there and unpack that propagandism that basically ties our hands behind our back to collaborate with the bosses.
Before I return to the audience, about basically, I guess what you saw as the failure of the left to actually embrace environmental justice, right? And yeah, why and how do we move beyond that?
Okay, I think let me start, and I take all of the comments that have been said. I think I came here wanting to learn. I wanted to hear the views of other comrades, but I think at the core of it is also wanting to see how the left can regroup, and how we can organize ourselves around a particular mass movement. And maybe it's a case of having to speak about the COSATU experience. I mean, COSATU has been a bit of a front runner in terms of especially the climate justice sort of discussions. I mean, as far as 2009 already, having adopted a resolution looking at climate justice and correctly positioning the climate justice within leftist politics, and that this is a particular workers' issue. I think as early as 2011, the case was already being made that if there is a climate devastation, that is a worker and poor issue. That is a worker and poor issue. The middle class and the rich can migrate themselves away from the crisis, whereas the poor and the workers have to grapple with degradation as well as disaster and dysfunction that comes with the climate crisis. In fact, myself and Professor Jacqueline Koch, when we looked at this idea of how to create a democracy within a just transition to a low-carbon economy, we even recognize the climate crisis as one particular pillar that can mobilize mass movements and the left, where together we can come with the labor movement playing a significant role because of how it mobilizes its membership, looking at age-old questions that the trade union movement has historically fought for, around the issues of the eradication between the pay gaps, between the richest and the poor, how to eradicate how do you eradicate inequality, as well as the socialization of basic services, as well as water and electricity. So I think this is probably one of the areas where I think we have an opportunity in which we can mobilize the left as well as progressive forces in order to create a mass movement. Taking into consideration that even in the trade union movement, there's the issues of vested rights, vested interests are a thing, where you see the levels of rivalry between trade unions not being very constructive towards the meeting of minds to create such a mass movement. But it's critical in order for us to then have a basis of the labor movement mobilizing mass movements in order to be able to address the climate crisis, because we definitely do locate it in left politics.
Sure. You've done a nice calendar on.
Yeah.
So speak about the calendar. See, I'm marketing in
Panelist talking about the calendar that we produced from young artistic collectives. It's an amazing calendar. It's on climate justice, environmental change in every month, and it talks about all the struggles that have taken place in different parts of the world, both historically and contemporary, around environmental justice. But I just wanted to relate to, I think, one of the key reasons why the left has failed, and I say the left again in this broadest sense of the term, to capture the imagination of people in relation to issues of environmental justice and climate, is because we generally bought into the Soviet model, which was production, 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 growth, growth, growth. It's not just a capitalist thing. It wasn't just about growth. You know, growth was not just a neoliberal thing. It was about, you know, the thing is to create more jobs, grow the economy more and more and more, and we don't worry about whether the coal mine is going to kill you when you're 35 years old because you're you're toxic. Don't worry about these environmental things, because the thing is, can you put food on the table? Can you have a job? So it was, to me, there's still a very narrow understanding of that. While you have to balance the realities, the material realities against these things, there are opportunities. The opportunities is to fundamentally think through a different way of living. A different way of, the left can I mean, that surely should be at the core of what we're saying. A different way of living, not just in terms of non-exploitation, against the boss, you know, that we must equality of wages and all the things that we fought for a long period of time, but the way in which we live with the environment around us. So, for example, in terms of in this country, you talk about how we can use land and water. These two things are fundamental to dealing with the environmental crisis, and it has to do with ownership. So it's a fundamentally capitalist issue and a relational issue about who owns what and who controls the resources, and therefore what kinds of production takes place, how it does in environmental destruction. So in that sense, I think there is a real possibilities here. You talked about a food garden movement. Absolutely. I mean, it's not just the cooperative movement here. You know, it seems to be a no-brainer for lefties to start pushing cooperative. But in the context of we can look at the union's attempts and NUM early on in terms of worker cooperatives for retrenched workers and others, but they all failed fundamentally because there was, my understanding of these is that fundamentally there was the issue of ownership, the issue of collective endeavor was not really addressed in any meaningful way. So I would just say that those opportunities really do exist for different ways of living, and to put at the forefront, the absolute forefront, you know, the green-red issues, the environmental justice in particular. So it's not just about clean air and clean water for all of us, it's about who gets fundamentally affected, who has the ability to do these things. That's connected with a public healthcare system, that's connected with public transport, that's connected with all the things that workers and lefties fight for. All the different public services, all the things that we fight for are linked to the environmental crisis and linked to that. So if we begin to draw the dots and connect them, we can build, I believe, that kind of movement, and people begin to make those connections, and therefore they take it in their own direction.
Sorry, can I comment? I think I'll be brief also because there have been many men speaking, but I do have a couple of questions or challenges. The one is the problem with the party form itself, or is this the emphasis placed now at the stage of history we are? And also interrogating the party form is that I think the one thing is that parties aren't necessarily just electoral machines, like they were the Bolsheviks in 1970 were an organized revolutionary force. But I think is it not the problem more that, given the state of, due to like decades of defeats and mistrust and trauma and all this disorganizing on the left, that we are at such a low level of organization and consciousness that our immediate aims might need to be more modest about strengthening education, strengthening the movements, the unions, the NGOs, the social movements, youth movements, and so on and so forth. And that's the kind of task of the day. But rather than necessarily saying we don't need a revolutionary party, but it might well be that, I'm supposing it's kind of, is it not maybe more the case that we are just way too disorganized at the moment and they're more immediate tasks? I think that's, and I think also the other thing I want to raise is that also is there still something in the Soviet model, at least not as it developed under the Stalin, really top down, but the early experiment in workers' democracy, and also the fundamental idea of workers' internationalism behind it.
Thank you. I'm a website. You can follow me on Twitter.
Instagram?
Madala. What's the handle?
Sociology Madala.
Sociology Madala, yeah.
Look, I sort of hesitate. Can I speak? Because I'm actually the fifth white man.
Yeah.
Nature, the audience, you forgive me for doing this. Look, thanks for this wonderful discussion. I really found it very informative, and of course I did come to listen, by the way. But one thing that caught my attention was, Dale, your suggestion of going back to grassroots organizations, but you spoke about creches and food gardens, and I just want to, I mean, it's a very interesting point, because I would argue that those are non-capitalist. When I watch young mothers taking their children to the creches in the morning when I go to work, they're going to these simple creches that Gauls have set up in the townships, and that I would argue that they are non-capitalist, not anti-capitalist. But the one that I thought was, that I would also focus on, and I wanted to share with you, would be Stockford. Now, in the research that my colleagues have done at the Southern Centre of Inequality Studies, they've shown that when you look at wealth in South Africa, assets, not income, assets, the majority, just over half of South Africans, it's not that they don't have assets, they have negative assets, they're in debt. Half the population is seriously in debt. Now the Stockvelds is a organic, rooted attempt at credit and rotating credit. And I think I have a question that I wanted to cover. I mean, you mentioned food gardens. Here's another example that you could give. But I think what you're raising, Dave, is if we're going to take the left forward from a grassroots position, it has to be rooted in the lived experience of ordinary people. That's what I'm coming to the conclusion. And my question really, well, there are two. I mean, one is, how widespread do you think these alternative anti-capitalist forms of organization? Because my general sense is, and I think it's a worthwhile research project actually to identify the nature of these creches, these stockfells, how they organize them, to what extent are they, I mean, obviously there's some monetary exchange that must be involved, because people have to make a living. What potential would they have for drawing into a broader grassroots-based movement? So it's a question really, it's to the House as a whole, not just to my friend Dale. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you. William, did you have one?
Yeah, well, if there's an on that, I think that would be best. Okay, thanks. So the question I have.
Comments now, please.
Mine is a question that's more of a comment.
Sure.
But piggybacks off what Rob was saying earlier, and I don't want to open up the can of worms that is the party electoralism question. But I think it's worth saying, and on the one hand, I do appreciate the need to expand our concept of what is political, to rethink the political instruments that we as the left wield. And all of that arises from a situation where the majority of South Africans are in retreat, they're widely disaffected, and that is true. But I think a significant reason for why that is the case is that many South Africans don't see an electoral alternative that resonates with them. And it still dominates the South African consciousness that elections represent the culmination of political activity in the country. And that can be read as a failure of political imagination, but I think it's also rooted in a rational recognition that the only real way to transform anything in this country is if you wield the state power. And I think that is truer for the left. If we want to deeply transform the society on issues of climate, of service delivery, so long as we live in capitalist democracy, which seems it will be the case for quite a substantial period of time, you can't do that if you're not within the state. That's the one thing. And I think the second thing is this question has a different character to it in this conjuncture than it would have 10, 15 years ago. Because I think for the very first time, we're seeing the prospect of the ANC's electoral dominance being massively undercut. Projections that they'll dip below 40% nationally, which is significant. And as was being identified earlier, if that is ground that is not swept up by the left, that is going to go to the populist right. And the consequences for the country, if that is the case, if the likes of the Patriotic Alliance, of Action SA, of the Democratic Alliance, of Operation Dudula, if they decide to organize politically, if they take that ground, the consequences are going to be catastrophic. So this is not to advocate for thinking of the party for 2024. I think that would be a massive mistake, and we'll see a repeat of the SRWP in 2019. But I do think it's important for us to think of an electoral strategy now that does at the same time build movements, build popular forces, and starts thinking about 2026 local government elections, 2029. And I'm just curious as to what that could look like and what the panelists think of taking the elections question seriously, but doing so on different terms and in a manner that might look as different to what we've historically known. Thanks.
Thank you. Who wants to begin?
So maybe I can take that. So there were two questions, and these questions are related. Questions about the party and the form or the kind of political instrument that we need. And a little bit there about the history of the Soviet Union and whether there isn't something there in the heritage and history of workers and the working class that we can draw from to inspire today. So, I mean, I take history seriously, and I think we should own that history as the collective heritage of working class people. But I also think that it's important in as much as we do that, and we do that because we also know that the right wants us to forget those moments historically, so that every time we think we are the first people to think about these ideas or to contend with these questions. But I think the here and now is also important, which is why I asked the question about how capitalism has morphed and changed, and how in that also the revolutionary subject itself has changed. And we need to contend with that. We are contending with that in any case. And that's important. The party, is it the party per se? Look, I think the Sovietized idea of a party or a party modeled around the CPSU is a non-starter for me. I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in a bureaucratic party, in a hierarchical party, in a party where rank consciousness reigns supreme and all of that. And that's what makes me, I'm not attracted to the SACP or even for that matter the EFF as it stands, because it's modeled around that idea of a party. So I think a political instrument, yes, but it doesn't necessarily have to look like that bureaucratized party with hierarchy, with rank, and with all sorts of problems that come with that. I think the space to experiment with different political forms. On the question of 2024, I think it's important that at least we are recognizing that, I mean, any attempt, I don't want to sound negative, but if we are discussing now about getting onto the ballot in 2024, then there is a big risk of having a united front performance on the ballot. Or even, did WASP got 8,000 votes when it contested, right? I mean, it's a serious, but I just think that if that's what we are discussing now, then there are some challenges with that. The idea of building for the long haul, sure. And it's healthy if we start it now, the discussion now. But again, it doesn't necessarily have to be that bureaucratized kind of party. We can experiment with a different political model. I don't know what that looks like. But I also know that the party model is not the only model that we can experiment with. A lot of other people are talking about, well, is there room for independence that organize collectively, but actually people run independently and into their communities. There's all sorts of conversations that I think we should be talking about. I don't think we necessarily need to be limited to the party model, at least not the way it looks, or the party as we've become accustomed accustomed to it.
Yeah, I want to agree with Pindi there. So there's definitely a need to dream, like what you say, right? Dream of what is possible. I personally don't think that our vision for socialism is incredibly out of reach. I don't think so. And just some of these ideas that are coming around in terms of grassroots movements, bottom-up politics, are the sorts of things that build the types of movement that we want to see. You're right about, 2024, the horse has bolted, really, to be quite honest with you. It really has. And my thing is, you were talking about needing to do the work. I think that should be the focus, doing the work and creating the alternative, because what currently exists, and like you said, people don't see themselves outside of the current because of a lack of alternatives. But the doing of the work is what will determine whether these visions that we have are achievable or not. And I think it's firmly rooted in bottom-up politics, because the whole hierarchical model, like what you've said, and the bureaucracy that creates is clearly not going to take us anywhere. So if you seek to create another party that replicates that, we sit with the same problem going into the future. So I think it's around the ideas of how to really build mass movements around these broad ambitions, especially around, I like the idea of grassroots, of grassroots movements. I think it's painfully missing in our society, and you can see it in the way in which politics manifests itself currently.
Can I just say, sorry, I just wanted to add a couple of things, because I think the question around the state is also fundamental to all left politics. It's the understanding of the state and the position. Is that there's still this notion of capturing the state. That you capture the state and then you wield the state in the interests of the working class. It's still a top-down approach. Because what you're saying is, vote for us, look at our program, vote for us, we put representatives in there, and then we'll implement those programs on your behalf through the state, because we can then take on capital and everything. And there's something to be said for that. But if we're serious about what we've just talked about in terms of bottom-up, let me just sketch this connections of all three of the questions very quickly, which is to say that the fundamental mistake, I would argue, since '94 of all left formations, is that they've come with the pre-packaged. They've come with everything is pre-packaged. And they've gone straight into national elections. Right from, right at the beginning with the Workers' Party right from '94, which contested the '94 elections. And so if you do not, as any organization and any organizer knows, if you don't do the groundwork, you're going to get smashed, because your base will not hold. So if you come in here, you've got your program, you've got your vanguard, you've got everything up, and you say, just do it the rest, you're going to get embarrassed, like the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party did. I mean, not even, it's best not even to talk about that performance. But in the context of a bottom-up approach, if you begin to do the painful hard work, if we begin to take this seriously as opposed to always seeking power in the institutional existent form, but seek power where it lies really, our theory tells us power lies with the class. Power lies with the workers. Well, let's take that practically seriously in the way we build, in the way we organize. And that's going to take a long time. Look at the Workers' Party in Brazil. To me, it's a classic example. It took the Workers' Party in Brazil 6, I think, elections, 5 different elections of getting defeated to get to a point where they captured state power. And then, obviously, when they captured it, by that stage, they had already almost entered into a terrain of a situation where they replicated a lot of those same things, because they had moved away from the MST and the base. So if we're going to be serious about that and the party form, it's not about the party per se. It's about your organizational form. If you recreate the hierarchies, you're going to recreate the things. As I said, just to give an example, if a left formation, mass grassroots built over a period of time comes up and is able to win, contest local first. Don't go to national, go to local. Start changing a municipality. Start creating examples. The way the Workers' Party did it was in Porto Alegre, where they started participatory democracy and budgeting. That caught the imagination of workers across the country. And then it just took off from there. You don't start from here and go down. And if we haven't learned that lesson, then we're going to repeat the mistakes of that. And so I would argue that in that context, it's the way in which if we do capture, let's say, a municipality. The first thing you do in a municipality is say that everybody, it doesn't matter if you're the general director, everybody's going to be paid a wage that is consistent with what workers and ordinary people have. Let's get rid of these hierarchies, not just in organizational form, but in material form. If we're serious, then we're going to be serious. And we've got to bite that bullet. This notion we've adopted of capitalist mentality, that the more you get paid, the better you are at your work. The more skilled you are at your work. Because you get paid more. And then we all look for that position. And we all look for that one because that's the one that's going to make us both our status as well as our... And we've got to get rid of that fundamentally to then create the form and the politics from the bottom up that we would like to see.
Thank you very much. Any woman out there? Please. Is there anyone who wants to contribute to the discussion? Oh, I saw your hand, but no, sorry.
So thank you to all the panelists for extremely enlivening insights. I want to pick up a little bit on some of the stuff that Will was raising, and I want to do it by posing a challenge to Comrade Dale, because it seems to me that the thrust of everything you're arguing is built around essentially a skepticism of power, and a skepticism of the notion that power has to be at the center of everything that the left does. So you started your very trenchant critique around this claim that the problem with the alliance is its entrapment in this, I think you called it the state party capital matrix. And that it was locked in this notion of how to change the world. Immediately I thought to myself, but why is that a problem? Because if the goal of the left is to transform the left, transform the world, then surely we have to start with what the world looks like. And the world is, in fact, locked into these institutions. And if we don't confront these institutions at a certain stage, to me it starts to become very unclear how we have any chance of changing it. Because the thing with power is that it doesn't go away if you turn your back on it. So we can build the alternatives, and we can organize in the interstices, and we can create our cooperatives. But those cooperatives still have to inhabit the world that we find in front of ourselves. So those cooperatives have to compete in a capitalist marketplace. And they have to compete in a competitive system that's guarded by the power of the state, and they have to play by the rules of the game of this system, and they have to therefore conform to the system. And the only way we change that is when we ourselves capture the institutions that hold power. And here's the critical thing, is that I think that ordinary people understand this fundamentally. Because they themselves are implicated in these systems of power in their day-to-day lives. They confront capitalist bosses. They confront the brutality of the capitalist marketplace. They confront the state and the police every single day. And that means when we come to them with a strategy of trying to change the world that ignores these institutions and that doesn't offer them a credible way of transforming these institutions directly, they turn their back on us. Right? And I think we have seen this repeatedly over and over in the last decade. So, Comrade, I think you're wrong when you say that the fundamental problem of the left has been its fixation on parties and all of these things. In fact, I guess it depends on the left that we're talking about. But the independent left for the last 25 plus decades has had the opposite fixation. It's a complete ignoring of the electoral arena of the need for parties. And this is true here, but it's true globally as well. We had this whole moment of changing the world without taking power, and the consequences of that, frankly, have been abysmal. It was a lost 2.5 decades, where every little bit of counter power and alternatives or whatever that we accumulated eventually dissipated because they didn't offer an alternative to the way institutions are governed today. And that's, this is the case with the whole independent left, the social movement wave. What do we have to speak for after decades of that strategy? Everything is virtually dissipated with powerful, literally one social movement. And the only reason we are seeing things starting to change in the last sort of decade globally is that we've gotten over this concern about whether power is for us. And we've seen the left in different parts of the world say no, and go back to a certain origin that says, as Will's making the point, that we don't do anything unless we have power, right? And that is true in many parts of the world. I spent the last 5 years in the USA. I got there in 2016 where the left had been decimated for decades. Nothing existed. In the 5 years that I lived there was an absolutely profound transformation. You have now the DSA, an organization of 100,000 people. Why did that happen? Because Bernie Sanders came along and he put forward an alternative that gave people a realistic sense of how power can be transformed. That took their critiques of the system and translated it into a sense of how collective power can be wielded through the institutions that dominate power. And it's the same thing over here. You know, I guess the jury is still out as to what, you know, happened today on the streets, but one way or another, this political organization brought tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets, shook the foundations of the state, terrified all of the institutions of this country. And why? Because they were effective at occupying a political space in the country. You know, not telling people that we have to turn away from the dominant institutions, but using those institutions to build power. And this is where I fundamentally agree with the other half of what you were saying, Comrade Dale, is that if we're going to build power, it has to be where our power lies, and that's in ordinary people. It has to be in the grassroots. We have to do the deep organizing that's attached just to the mobilizing. We can't just come out here with the right slogan and imagine people are going to flock to our banner and agree with everything we say. We have to find ways of showing that we're relevant to people in their everyday lives, in building deep structures. But that's not inimical to the challenge of building institutions that can challenge power. In fact, it's dependent on it. It's only when we can show that the organizing that we do at a grassroots level is connected to a bigger strategy of how we transform the world that will ever become effective. And the only way that's ever been effective is through the party form. And this is why I think the other speakers have been correct to say, yeah, we screwed up on parties in the past. But does that mean the party itself is dead, or does that mean we have to rethink how we do the party? That it cannot be this vanguard. It has to be something that takes seriously where mass power lies.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I
Can I chip in before?
Okay, no, please, go ahead.
So listening to what Neil was saying and what you were saying, so it sounds very much like we're having that old debate between John Holloway and Alex Kalinikos, right? And I must say, listening to Dale, I had some skepticism around the state, but I thought we were talking about within the state, outside the state, but also thinking about beyond the state, which is, I think, where left debates are now, unless if I'm mistaken. And so yeah, I just wanted to put that challenge. If you're going back to that old debate between Holloway and Kalinikos, change the world without taking power. If you don't take power, what power takes you? That sort of. I said I didn't hear that, and maybe I'm also challenging you, Dale, to sort of clarify whether is that really, are you asking us to ignore the state? Because I certainly don't believe in ignoring the state.
No, I think that there's, and I welcome the provocation, because I think it's an important one. I wasn't saying that at all. And I wasn't dismissing power. I was talking about what kind of power that we orient towards, and what kind of power we engage, and what kind of power we contest, and therefore what kind of power we're going to transform and wield. And if it's existent versus contingent, then I would argue that the reason why, and Niall, it's wrong to say that for the last 25 years, the reason why the left has failed is because social movements have not wanted to go into state power. Right from the beginning, the dominant left in this country for the first 10 years was about conquering state power, accessing it. I was in that battle at the same time. We tried. Our line in the SACP was we break from the ANC in 1997. And we form a workers' party, and we contest the power, and we go with it in that context. We lost that battle. Obviously, everybody got pushed out or co-opted or whatever, and we've seen the results. The space that was then taken was a space to build new forms of power, to build new contestation, because we couldn't just say, well, let's just go and sit on the sidelines and wait till some good people join the ANC and SACP, or let's form another WASP, or let's form another Workers' Party to contest elections when we haven't done the groundwork. So what I'm trying to say is this, is that it's not about dismissing the state. It's about how you get to the point of contesting that power. And how the journey that you travel to create the power that will allow you to have representatives and take control of the municipal council. And then once you take control of that power, and that's a state, there's a state, it's just a question of whether people think of the state as a national state, which I think is a mental trap that the left has found itself in, and a nationalist trap that we found ourselves in to accept this. We go down to the local level and you capture or you win, I wouldn't say capture, you win that power through popular participation and popular vote, but you've done so because you've created a movement that can sustain and then begin to transform relationships within that state, and therefore begin. So cooperatives, it's not about trying to see cooperatives as an alternative, it's about, for example, if we were the mayor and we had everything else, we had that municipal power, let's take all the developmental budget and push it towards structures that are cooperatives as opposed to private enterprises and BEE and private capitalist enterprises. That fundamentally changes social relations within townships. It fundamentally changes, it's a question of what class you're trying to build and what class and social relations you're trying to build through that state power. So I'm not dismissing power at all. I'm talking about the forms that we create in order to try to, the vehicle, as well as then the nature of the relationship of accessing that power and how we then wield it. Because if we simply occupy, my metaphor that I used in this book was the house. And just let me play that metaphor quickly. I said, South Africa, imagine as a house. National Party was the landlords, right? Fought a battle, came to negotiations. The one set of landlords walks out the front door, the next set of landlords walks in the door, the ANC. And they take power. They take the house, they own the house now, supposedly, at least in institutional terms. And they try to wield it. Now, good things can happen, certain things. The rooms change, we get new paint jobs. But nobody pays attention to the foundations of the house, which are rotten. Nobody talks about the foundations. Nobody pays any attention to them. We've got policies, we've got things. So eventually what happens is those foundations, which are fundamental in terms of social class relations, about how we understand the state, then just basically fester and then begin to collapse the house, which is what's happening right now. So the very form of how we walk into the house, how we get to that journey of the house, how then we exercise the power once we're in the house, these are the questions that I was trying to raise in the context of having that proper debate. Because I think if we get into the old, it's either inside, outside versus this, then we're going backwards. I think we have to transform and recreate and think of new things. And here, none of us have the answers. Nobody has those answers. It's in the doing and in the struggling that I think are going to, and hopefully we can get to a point, if we're all decent, I would imagine that philosophically most of us here are communists in the philosophical sense, not a communist. As I said, you don't have to belong to a communist party to be a communist. In fact, generally, there's no direct connection. Because communist philosophy is about power then becomes dispersed. Power becomes, you don't have to have a central form of power. But to get there, that's the challenge. So thank you for that provocation. And I think what it does is it enriches our debate and enriches us in terms of the ideas. It's not an either or.
Well, on that note, we've been at it for 2 hours, which is great. And so I do want to close this session. It's a conversation that needs to take place, and I imagine there'll be more of these to come. And so I just want to thank our panelists for their contributions, and also to thank you for your attention and your own contribution. And I think you're going to close the session for us.
Yeah. I'm going to be very brief. I just want to say, on behalf of Africa as a country, our deepest gratitude to Basani, Lebohang, Indile, and Dale for coming and enriching us with deeply enlightening interventions, provocations, reflections, and thoughts. Thank you to everyone who helped put this event together, to Niall for helping out, to Shaira and Nero and Taz for recording this, for Tsoho as well, in absentia, to Bruce, Claire, and Sean Jacobs, my boss, and most importantly to all of you who came out tonight. I think as all of the panelists have emphasized, we're at a moment where we need to regroup, we need to reimagine, and fundamentally we need to reorganize. And the purposes of gatherings like this is, although they're pitched at the intellectual, ideological level, really what we're trying to do is to get us to see each other face to face again, to have these conversations, to rebuild those relationships, rebuild those networks, and hopefully to rebuild the foundation upon which we can build a new house. And that can only happen in struggle. So we've got a long road ahead. I think all of us recognize that. We want to do more of this. We're hoping later this year to stage a conference of the left, if you will, where we can all be gathered in a room together and leave with an idea of what we're going to do in the next period, concretely, on the front lines, struggling together in order to transform this country. Because I think by all indications, all of the signs, as everyone is saying, is that if we don't do anything, then we're screwed. The house is going to crumble right before us. So just another word of thanks to everyone for coming out today, to Breeze Block for hosting us. You've been absolutely exceptional.